This episode is brought to you by Formula Nootropics, a company that allows you to pick custom stacks that perfectly meet your needs in a cognitive enhancement blend. And if you use the coupon code Jesso, you will get 20% off your first order. jameswjesso.com/formula to find out more. Hello everyone, welcome back to Adventures Through the Mind. I am your host, as always, James W. Jesso. If this is your first time here, Adventures Through the Mind is a podcast that explores topics relevant to psychedelic culture, medicine, and or research. With that in mind, my deeper consideration around the curation of conversation on this show is to create a dynamic cultural conversation about what it looks like to integrate psychedelics not only into our lives, and I don't mean this necessarily in the sense that we're always taking psychedelics, but the psychedelic experience has a place in our lives and also a place in our culture, because it is going to be on the in the subcultural, the petri dish of the subculture, that the patterns that will become the mainstream culture's adoption or institutionalizing of psychedelics will come from. Did that sentence make sense? Anyways, so that's the intention of the show. And of all the guests that I've had on the show, some of them really narrow in on one point or another, one sort of aspect, one sort of discipline in this larger process of sort of, seeding or cultivating inside of the subcultural petri dish things that will be able to come to full fruit in the larger mainstream culture. And some people kind of are right on the actuality of the thing. Some people are just really deeply exploring it from the cultural angle and able to do so with a complex systems mindset. And our guest for today, Jerónimo M.M, is one of those people. His ability to think very complexly. I don't mean this in the sense that it's hard to understand, but in the sense that it is not overtly simplified to the point where it becomes a flattened generalization of topic, but he's able to really think deeply and complexly about things so as to really get a sense of what it is that we're working with, and to do so in a way that, like I just said, is easy to understand. So I'm very excited to have him on the show today. Jerónimo M.M. is a documentary filmmaker, independent researcher, and interaction designer with extensive knowledge in the world of ayahuasca. In the past decade, he has produced, written, and directed 2 documentaries about ayahuasca. The first about the Brazilian ayahuasca churches, the second about the use of ayahuasca in the treatment of drug addiction. He has traveled extensively through South America, researching a broad range of ayahuasca practices, and has lectured internationally on ayahuasca tourism and the appropriation of indigenous knowledge. He is currently the Social Innovation Coordinator of ICEERS, which stands for the International Center for Ethnobotanical Education, Research, and Service. It is a nonprofit organization dedicated to transforming society's relationship with psychoactive plants, doing so by engaging with some of the fundamental issues resulting from the globalization of ayahuasca, iboga, and other ethnobotanicals. So Jerónimo is on the show specifically to talk about the problems, the challenges that we will be presented with in a post-prohibition world, where he's here to talk about what are some of the things that we need to be thinking about now so that we can attend to the challenges of the unintended consequences of eliminating prohibition on psychedelics, which is going to be happening eventually and is already happening in different ways in different places around the world. I really enjoyed this conversation with Jerónimo. It was something I was very excited about because I've really respected and appreciated his work over the years, and I anticipate that you will also really enjoy this episode. Before we get into it, big thank you to my patrons on Patreon. especially the people whose names are listed on the screen here on YouTube or in the description to this episode, is they are giving at least $23 a month, which is how their name gets explicitly mentioned in the credits. Big thank you to all of my patrons nonetheless, especially in this time of economic uncertainty and instability during the pandemic. Your continued voluntary contributions of finances to the show makes a huge difference, as I also make sense of the economic complexities that the pandemic has brought into my life. So thank you very, very, very much for continuing to be my patron. For you who are listening who are not yet a patron, if you are not impacted in a way where it would become unsustainable for you to throw me a few dollars a month and you would like to support the show, please become my patron on Patreon. You can do so for as little as $2 a month. And if you do so at $8 a month, you get access to a special Dropbox folder with a bunch of super cool and some exclusive content and content that you would otherwise have to pay for elsewhere. So you can do that by heading to patreon.com/James W. Jesso, or you could leave a one-time PayPal donation if you just want to toss me a couple bucks just right away. Go for it. You'll find a link to that in the description to this episode as well. So thank you for your financial support in producing this podcast, and thank you for tuning in to this episode with Jerónimo M.M. on Adventures Through the Mind. All right, so then Jerónimo M.M., welcome to Adventures Through the Mind.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's a long time running to have you on the show. I mean, we met at Breaking Convention last year, but I actually have been interested in your work for quite some time. I think you had given a lecture several years ago that had, and I don't remember the full content of the lecture, but there was something there about how we are. Even the people who believe themselves to be, positive contributors to sort of like the future culture are still contributing to damage in the world. And the example at one point you had used was that the people who want to that appreciate the preserved, pristine, beautiful natural spaces around the world, who are questing that out, are also the people that are laying the paths for what will eventually be the tourism to follow them there, to then open up tourist industry, which then damages the place that they care about, so they move to somewhere else, and that only follows them there further and further. And I can't remember the whole content of that lecture, but that particular piece really stuck with me, and it's actually been since then that I've been hoping to get you on the show.
Yes, that's actually called the paradox of tourism, and it comes from the field of tourism studies. And the paradox of tourism is that precisely what it looks for, authentic places where there are no other tourists, empty beaches, pristine nature, empty spaces, empty spectacular spaces, all of these things that tourism looks for. When it finds them, by its very nature, it ends up destroying what they are, and then it has to move somewhere else. And then the even more unfortunate part about this is that I also realized that backpackers such as myself, which weeks I spend a lot of my youth doing this, are in a way the first line of entry. It's the backpackers that arrive first. And you can see this or the hippies or whatever. You can see this in Ibiza or in Thailand, in Fanam Beach. I mean, it's the stories are endless. I remember being in a really fantastic island in Greece that is just tiny. It just had like 100 meters of paved road, no villages, and people would camp out in the beach for the entire summer. And that was one of the things that. There's this old fisherman that was, old hippie guy that had the most amazing cabin that he had built himself, and he was camped out almost year round. That was the one thing he asked me, please don't tell anybody about this place. And I didn't, but it's now also being sort of swamped, and it's impossible. That's the paradox.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I saw it in myself, or in my experiences of Thailand, having gone back there in 2016 and having been there for the first time in 2009, and remember going to a place called Pai, in the north.
Mm.
And it was just like this beautiful, sleepy little town that basically everything kind of shut down at like 5 or 6 p.m. There wasn't really much going on. And the only thing that there really was going on was this beautiful little bar thing behind one of the temples on the main road that had live acoustic jazz music every night. And there was nowhere to go to get a good coffee there at any time of the day. And when I went back in 2016, it had essentially become like the Copenhagen of the hills, the Copenhagen of the north. And it was like a party place, and there was like yoga studio. There was only one yoga studio when I was there in 2009, if I remember correctly. And then there was like 5 there now. And like, so it's interesting to see how it follows, how that development continues.
Yeah, it seems there's a beautiful documentary about this called Gringo Trails that you can find on Vimeo, which is exactly about this. And at the end, there's a few examples of communities that have managed to organize themselves in a way that the influx of tourism and money and stuff is actually beneficial to the community, but maintains basic structures. I mean, these are always very, very fragile environments. And that's the tricky part. And none of us want to deny ourselves of this. I heard like the biggest tree, I don't know if it's the biggest sequoia or something like this in one of these parks, is actually kept a national secret. It's the tallest tree in the world, or it's the thing like because if people went to see it, and just the effect of them stepping on the ground around the tree would create it would compact the ground to a degree where the rain wouldn't get in, and that would begin to hurt the tree. These things are very they're very complex to manage in a sustainable, in a healthy way. My first experience with indigenous shamanism, which was almost 20 years ago, we went to Huautla de Jimenez, which is the village in Mexico where Maria Sabina comes from. Maria Sabina is the famous, shaman of the mushrooms in Mexico that was discovered in the 50s but Gordon Watson found her in the 50s and then wrote this article on Life magazine, and then everybody started to arrive. When we arrived there, 40, 50 years later, the entire village, not the entire village, but large parts of the village basically revolve around this mushroom tourism. As soon as we got off the bus and it was like 3 a.m, people were offering us mushrooms. The taxi were called Maria Sabina. The taxi stop was called Maria Sabina. All the stores sold mushroom postcards, and it seemed like everybody had an aunt who was a shamana. And this is of course is the law of supply and demand. So that and it's nobody's ill will. Nobody's set up to turn the village into that. It happens quite naturally, quite by itself. That's why these dynamics are so hard to manage.
It's interesting because this wasn't essentially the topic that we were or that we are gearing towards, but we're sort of like maybe inching our way into it, because I'm thinking now about Iquitos and about ayahuasca tourism and sort of what the impact of ayahuasca tourism has been on Iquitos. Now, Iquitos itself, and I'm going to say what I know, and I want you to correct me where I'm wrong, that the city itself its first sort of blossom was with the influx of money out of the rubber boom, if I remember correctly. Mm-hmm. And then a lot of the issues that are present there are present as a long-standing history of colonial extractivism, and especially with the rubber boom, and that ayahuasca tourism is showing up in what was already a mess. And so my thoughts here, and this again, we'll get into the actual topic we were intending to talk about here. My thoughts here are, given the context of what we've been talking about so far, what do you think about the impact of ayahuasca tourism in this situation? Because on some hand, it's like, okay, it's not making things any better, and now everyone's uncle is a shaman. And I remember I got approached by what looked like a 15-year-old who told me they had ayahuasca, and I said, no, that's okay, man, I'm sorted. And so their immediate next thing was like, well, cocaine? Like, oh, no, I don't want that either. But then on another end, there's an influx of industry that's providing economic, some sort of economic influx that can positively impact people, like shamans who now their jobs, or curanderos now have an industry there, and that there's jobs being made for people. And this is a weird sort of idea, like, oh, the Western person comes in and saves the indigenous people from the horrors of their life with jobs and like positions at the retreat centers or whatever else. But what is your thoughts on the impact ayahuasca tourism is having in the cultural atmosphere of Iquitos, essentially?
Well, I mean, I think like everything, it's ambiguous, right? Is the glass half full or half empty? I don't think none of the things out there in the world lend themselves most often to very clear, is this good or is this bad? Unfortunately, there's been a if one takes a negative lens and we say, okay, how has this affected the traditions, the local community, blah 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 blah, then of course you can find things, and then you can take a positive lens and you can say, well, how has this affected the economy? Certain people, is traditional medicine now looked at it with more high regard than before, etc. And you also get answers there. I think that the trickiest part in this, it's how to learn to establish sort of reciprocal relationships that are equally beneficial, right? So when because otherwise they will tend to be disbalanced. And I think this happens in general, in the relationships between people from the West, from the global North, and indigenous communities in South America. It's very, very difficult to do this right, and very, very easy to do it wrong. And for this, what you need is sort of like better practices, better forms of wisdom. I will give you an example from another field. I work in documentaries for a number of years. I made a number of documentaries. Most of them revolve around indigenous knowledge. And on the last documentary, I was working with some people from the BBC, including Bruce Parry had a long experience with this. And usually, when you with this, I mean going filming in indigenous communities. So when you go filming in indigenous communities, it is a fact that certain people get jobs. You need cooks, you need porters, you need all sorts of help, and these people get paid. And it's also true that at the end you can't. It's the nature of filmmaking that you can't really film an entire community. You end up sort of focusing on one family, on a couple of characters, and there's a few people that get more camera time, more attention. They put more into the documentary than everybody else. The tendency would be to, in our cultures, would be to reward these people as well. Say, look, you've been working more, you've put more time, more money, more effort, more this, more that. So you're getting a special payment as well. Mm-hmm. What they found, and this comes from their experience of many, many years, is that when you do this and you leave the community in a worse position than it was, because you've created an inequality that wasn't there before. And inequality in horizontal flat societies is very, very destructive, because it generates, it just makes social harmony. It creates this harmony where there wasn't. So the rule was that, of course, at the end of the shooting, there is a payment that is done for all the time, effort, and help that these people, that the community has given. But this always takes the form of a community thing. So it's not are we paying individuals, but what does the community need? Do they need some medicines? Do they need help with a broken generator or an outboard motor? Whatever the gift is for the entire community, and this is always made clear. This is and it is the entire community who asks, agrees what they would need. This is the type of this type of wisdom, of knowledge around the best practices. I think it's what's really, really important here. That's why I go back to that documentary, Gringo Tales, and a few examples at the end of communities that have managed to do tourism sustainable. The last thing you want to do is you want to have a community that are just, like it happens in some places, sort of waiting all day for the tourists to arrive, and when they arrive, they all dress in the traditional gear, they do the dance, and then they wait for the next, for the next car. There is a way, because then the culture becomes a spectacle for the consumption of others. Again, there's also very deep, real, important material needs in many of these communities, and there is a lot of good that could come from getting visits, getting attention, getting the arrival of money. But how do you manage this in a wise way so that it's really mutually beneficial? Because the nature of extractive processes is that we get the best out of it. So if we, and I've lived through this many times, I've been enormously helped in my life, in my, in every aspect that I can count by the time that I've spent with indigenous people and the plants that I've taken with them, But what did the indigenous people that gave me those plants got? Well, they got very generously and fairly paid, but I get to, make movies, be on podcasts, people, give talks, people, the benefits that I've gotten. And this is the nature of asymmetric relationships. So how do you make sure that you give back as much as you got, or at least a proportional part? This is really the work of a lifetime. I can't say I'm sorry that I'm still at it, but you need to be aware of this, as you approach these things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Especially too, it's like, how do you give back in a way that meets that value exchange, and if you think of it, I mean, in the Western world, it's very much like products and service for money. That's the exchange. And if you were to give back to them, like, I'm gonna give them a percentage of all the income that I make from all this opportunity, and it just goes to the shaman. It creates the very problem that you were mentioning that these documentaries were attempting to resolve. And then if you think about it from a cost for cost thing, it's like maybe you're making now, quite a bit more in your career, right? And that the amount that you give back is, I don't know, you give a generator to the community or something, which has as profound an impact, but it's maybe literally 3% of the benefit that you've made or something along those lines. Does that count as balance? And in a Western context, it doesn't, because you've now exploited those people financially and you've only given them back this small amount of what you've made. But if you were to meet it with the sort of fiscal equivalent, then you would actually harm them in the long run. So it sounds like a very complicated and difficult dance to do.
Yeah. Once I heard somebody say that sort of material lack, so poverty, it's a terrible thing and it's very destructive. But inequality in certain communities is even more destructive. So when you have a situation where everybody's basically at the same level, there's all sorts of problems but when one person in that community suddenly begins to rise above the others, then a whole new set of problems is being created. That's the reason why in these documentaries they avoided, of course they paid people for their work, but they avoided focusing the interchange on just one person or just one family, even though they ended up maybe appearing the most or doing most of the participation or the work, because then you create an inequality. And then that doesn't work. Now we deal with inequality in a much more, I don't know if it's better or worse, but we sort of lived it. But this is not the case in many other places.
So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about what happens after the psychedelic renaissance. You were talking about this at Breaking Convention. Your talk after the psychedelic renaissance was exploring what you saw was the real challenges that we're facing right now, insofar as the psychedelic renaissance return or the integration of psychedelics into the modern Western world, not being a legislative problem or a legal problem or a prohibition problem so much as it's a cultural problem. And it's a cultural problem that we maybe aren't anticipating as we call for decriminalization and the end of prohibition. So can you give me a sense of what you mean by all of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, when cultures are given enough time, they are able to find quite amazingly adaptive measures to just everything. You can see this with very simple things. You can see this with the way we make cappuccinos now and how much is improved in the past 20 years. Now it's basically magic what people can draw on cappuccinos. Or you can look at the way surfers and what they can do now, or skateboarders and how it started 60 years ago and it was just the kids and now it's like magic circus tricks. But you can also look, for example, in most of the Amazon indigenous, the base food in many indigenous communities in the Amazon is what is called bitter manioc, as opposed to sweet manioc. Bitter manioc is one of the most poisonous plants in the world. It's soaked in cyanide. Cyanide is the poison well-known poison. Now, this is after thousands of years, they've developed a relationship with this, where they have very complex process to scrape and then dry and then squeeze, and then they make these cakes and they get all the cyanide out. So, you can even give cultures, extremely toxic things, and they will find ways to turn it into food and make it useful if you give them enough time. Now, the issue with psychedelics is that they are really very new to us. I mean, it's true, and there's many possibilities that they were, on a distant past, they were part of our cultures. But that hasn't been the case for a very, very long time. So what happens is that actually we don't have any space for this. We literally don't have any space in our culture for this. Again, it's easier to see with an example. If you look at yoga, yoga comes from India, everybody knows this, and it's a sort of moving meditation, and it was built as a spiritual practice in a path to enlightenment. Now, as yoga begins to arrive to our culture, we find that in our culture, we don't have a space for something that is a mixture of prayer and movement. We don't have a place where that could take place. But we do have a place for movement, it's called the gym. And that's what yoga ends up, And in the process, it begins to transform itself. Many of the esoteric things are being lost, and the physical aspects are being potentiated. And then you find, not in all cases, but in many, I have to stress this, but in many, yoga becomes a sort of not a path to enlightenment, but a path to a better looking body, and to feeling good. So this is what happens when we fit things in the spaces we have instead of in the spaces where they belong. So because culturally we don't have a place for psychedelics, we're tending to fit them in the places that we have. So some places that we have is, one is religion, and there's many, for example, ayahuasca, there's a number of ayahuasca religions, who are slowly pushing their way towards, recognition and legality. They have a place. But, we have a whole bunch of practices around shamanism. You can sort of, with some effort, you can sort of twist and argue that shamanism is a religion, but the fact is it doesn't look anything like, what we consider a religion, with a doctrinal body, with a history of this and a way of expressing the teachings, etc. So we can try to fit it there. Now we have another space that is, medicalization. We have a space for medicines. And, there's been great work doing by MAPS and Compass and these people, and I think, I think it's great that this is happening, that there will be, people who, desperately need it, and depressed people and PTSD people will be able to access one day these medicines legally, and that's great. Except that, that's really, the most important thing that happens with psychedelics. Is perhaps not what they do to sick people, but what they do to normal people. The non-medical uses of psychedelics are actually, for most of us, what got us here and what interests us. But because we don't have a space for a medicine that is for well-being, for a medicine that is for finding life purpose, for a medicine that is for remembering who you are, for, and perhaps medicine is not the right word here, but for this tool, we don't have this. This is not in the church. This is not exactly in therapy. This is not exactly in medicine. This is somewhere else. We try to shoehorn it, and we're seeing, again, I think the medicalization of psychedelics is fantastic. I would be concerned if opening that door closes all the others. Mm-hmm. I mean, if we can make psilocybin a prescription drug, I think it's a good thing. Unless that means that, Mazatec shamans who have been working for this for thousands of years couldn't come and practice their work because, we have pretty strict rules about non-doctors applying medicines in our society.
Mm-hmm. So or even a person to take it themselves off into the woods on their own. If we legalize it for medical purposes, well, what about the purposes of someone who has a deep personal relationship with it that is spiritual but not necessarily religious? Does that get doubled down even harder, the way cannabis is now legal in Canada, but the consequences for selling it without being a licensed provider are more extreme than they were before legalization?
Exactly. That's the law of unintended consequences, right? So that's how you have an idea that you think is a good idea. For example, before the prohibition of alcohol, they were saying, alcohol destroys all of these lives. So it increased violence, it's increased, all of this, and it's all true.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps we should get rid of alcohol, prohibit it, and then we'll get rid of the problems. And this sounds like a good idea. I have a good idea, but it sounds, logical.
Yeah.
Except that every new solution brings new problems, and these problems are unpredictable, and sometimes they're much, much worse. And that's what we saw with alcohol prohibition. So I think now we find ourselves in the middle of another prohibition, prohibition of psychedelics and other drugs. And, I imagine most people listening to this podcast are anti-prohibitionist. The thing is, we are very aware of the unintended consequences of prohibition, but perhaps we're not giving enough thought of what could be the unintended consequences of de-prohibition or decriminalization or legalization or regularization. Mm-hmm. So this is a topic that I've been giving a lot of thought over the past few years. And it's an important part of the work that we're trying to do with ICERS, is that we're trying to also, we are reacting to a lot of immediate things that need attention in research, in legal issues, et cetera, but we're also trying to make sure that we try to look 15, 20 years into the future and begin to imagine, in collaboration with the different psychedelic communities, what type of integration of these plants, of these substances we would like to see. Because it's really up to us. If we don't come up with this model, then the government will, and it's going to be much, much worse than what we could propose. Mm-hmm. So we think a lot about how to make this inclusive. There was a draft law, for example, for cannabis that we helped work on in Spain. It never got past the project, but for example, that was good. We really tried to include everybody. So medical use, commercial growers, small time growers, personal use, personal crops. We try to really make sure that if you are going to sort of regulate or legislate around anything, that all the different actors, stakeholders, players are included. Because what you don't want to do is you make a path like it happened in Canada, which is basically a bureaucratic path to become a cannabis grower, and then you find that the people who were traditionally growing cannabis, they can't keep up with all of this bureaucracy. They knew a lot about growing cannabis, and they spent their life, but they couldn't sort of set up these structures, and they ended up being pushed off to the side and facing, exactly much harsher crimes, much harsher fines than before, and in some cases, and these are the unintended consequences, moving on to other drugs, or harder drugs, because they were pushed out of the system.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. One of the pieces of language I really appreciated in your Breaking Convention talk was that we amputate things. So we're importing, because we don't have psychedelic stuff happening here in the Western world or whatever. Our modern civilization doesn't have a space for it, and yet it's coming in, and so we're trying to figure out how to put it in. And on some level, we're looking around like, how did other cultures do it? Okay. But then you said like ayahuasca is a medicine, and it's in the talk, you say it's a medicine, and it's an education, and it's spiritual practice. And it doesn't fit in any particular category. And the language you use is that we end up taking, like, not necessarily the case with ayahuasca right now. This is where you said it kind of bucks the trend, but we have historically ended up taking plants out of, like, and importing them, and then taking them out of their cultural context, and then bringing the use of the plants, but not any of the culture around that use. That, as you had said, you give a culture long enough times, and they can even make poison into food. That we kind of lose that part, and that process is a process of sort of amputating something essential about that plant and its relationship to humans as we integrate it. And so thinking about bringing in psychedelics now, like there's the medicalization tract, which again, like we both say, like, that's good, let's keep that going. However, here are some concerns, right? And then there's other ways to sort of legitimize it, like religion, but it's not entirely religion. And you have this quote in your talk, which I thought was fantastic, and it really fits with with my thoughts on things right now. And very much this whole thing that you're talking about is really in alignment with what I want to do with this podcast, which is really start to be like, okay, well, let's have conversations about things that are all relevant to being human and alive, and wonder about how those things fit into the context of psychedelics as a part of our lives, so that there's a cultural context for a psychedelic use that is directly relevant to a sort of complex thinking about what it means to be a human, a part of the modern Western civilization, taking psychedelics as psychedelics come in. And in that is, of course, interacting with the mainstream. And this is your quote: "The danger is in the path of transforming the relationships of our societies with psychedelics. Instead, what we do is transform psychedelics until our society as it is today can digest it." And it makes me think of Stephen Jenkinson saying, when we're going mainstream, what ends up happening is we start shaving the edges off this thing until it's so palatable that it's basically indistinguishable from the mainstream itself. So what are your thoughts around that? For me, I end up wanting to stay away from reading guys like Michael Pollan and this kind of thing, because I don't want to be having the Michael Pollan conversation. I don't want to be speaking Michael Pollan's language as I think about these things, as I talk about these things. But what are your thoughts on this process? What does it look like for us as a psychedelic culture to be aware of this danger and to engage it in a way where we're still helping to show up to the mainstream's, integration of psychedelics?
Yeah, I have a small story about that. Some time ago, I was doing this, commercial work, like I said, my other life. I've done sort of large design projects, and this was, very big client, very corporate thing, very complicated, and many moving pieces, and I had to jump in, and I was working 1 month, 7 days a week, and it was meetings all day. There was 11 different countries involved, and lots of discussions, and very complicated, and it came, and so I decided to microdose LSD, and I was taking every 3 days, and it really helped me with the work. But then, at some point I realized, there's something really paradoxical here. People used to take LSD to quit the office, and here I am taking it so I can, be more efficient in it, under inhuman pressure. This is an example of how we will have this tendency to do that, right? We will have this tendency to sort of fit psychedelics and amputate many things about them, and just sort of make them comfortable for things as they are, But I think in this thing, I think it's very important. One thing that I always say is, I think the energy. This is also the way of the world. If you look at, I don't know, poetry, mystical poetry, there's 3 guys, they're probably, or 3 persons, who are like deeply committed to a thing, or 20 or 50 are deeply committed, they live very humbly, and they are creating amazing work. And then there's, 50 or 200 people that are doing so-so, and then there's 2,000 people writing bad spiritual poetry, and then there's postcard poetry. Mm-hmm. And it's the same thing with filmmaking, and it's the same thing with music, and it's the same thing with therapy, with food, with everything, right? This is the way of the world. There's always going to be, a large sort of delusion at the base of things, where things get very diluted, and then somewhere on the top, there's going to be a group of people that are extremely committed to doing the best possible work. The job of the Film Academy is not to fight bad films. There's always going to be bad films. The job of the Film Academy is to recognize and reward the work of the people that are doing amazing work. Mm. I think this sort of focus, this sort of shifting focus, would be very useful in general in the sort of psychedelic scene. It's not about who's doing bad work, because there always will be bad work, and not just that, there's going to be more and more and more and more as these things, there's sort of a gold rush now around psychedelics, and it's a hype, and, droves of people are going to arrive, and they're going to do all sorts of things that we might find, unpalatable or tasteless, or even worse. The issue is not that. The issue is not to fight that. I don't think you can fight that. But I think what we can do, and what we need to do, is to create systems, within what we do, that recognize recognizes, rewards, and sort of like gives attention and gives focus to the people who are doing incredible work, who are incredibly committed, who have been working on this for a very long time, who are thinking deeply about this, and who ultimately become sort of a reference for everybody. I think at least for myself, that's how I try to approach this, because these conversations very often goes to, oh, it's all going to hell, and it was better before they were famous, and right? It's like the bands that we all liked, and all of this. But the thing is, I don't think much can be done about that. I think it's the way of the world, it's the way of our cultures, right? What we can do, though, it's really make sure that the people that are doing, important, amazing, committed, profound work, get recognition somehow, and get given the sort of I don't know if this is a word, this status or the sort of, but the place that they deserve, which is a sort of as reference points for everybody, as pointers of what this could be in the best of circumstances, which is what happens with poetry, with with filmmaking, and with everything else. There's a few people there that just become sort of, they become models for everyone.
It's interesting. That's almost like part of my language, but it's almost like a capitalist approach to things in some sense, because it's like in capitalism there's sort of a competitive edge to the acquisition of capital, and so it's like and that draws everybody, we'll say, if the goal of capitalism was supposedly a better quality of life for civilization. Didn't turn out that way, but it's to bring everybody up as we all sort of like move and compete our ways to the top, which might be something akin to what you're talking about here, which is like, instead of making the culture all about sort of like pointing fingers at and getting angry where things are going wrong, we're actively making efforts towards doing things really well, and then actively acknowledging that the people and the groups are doing these well things as a point of celebrating something. I think this is maybe a Buddhist tradition, and I had heard it talked about in other sort of like personal development type things, which is like to meditate on the Buddha as if you are the Buddha, or that another one is like, if there's somebody who's doing something that you really like in the world, instead of getting down on yourself for not being able to do it, you celebrate that they can do it, and something about that calls it out more so in yourself. And I could see something like that happening inside of psychedelic culture we do have to continue to talk critically about, what's often called like bad actors in the scene, and find ways to deal with that. And also at the same time, not to forget that there are people who are doing really positive, incredible work, and that giving them a spotlight exposes that quality of work to more people, which allows more people to be inspired to step in to that way of being in psychedelic culture, which then would influence more people, and then sort of like create this lift, this sort of progressive trend towards sort of, betterment in the culture itself.
Yeah, again, it's like I think it's like everything else. If you look at everything else in our culture, whatever, from yoga to cooking to literature, to this is sort of how it works. There seems to be a few people who are extremely successful, by sort of diluting. I'm talking about Sylvester Stallone movies, right? But that's not exactly the high artistic point of filmmaking. It's not.
I don't know, man. Back in the 80s, like the 1980s action film, that was like apex of action movies.
Rocky, the first Rocky was quite amazing. Yeah. So, but you know what I mean, right? It's not, and there always be the sort of, people that seem to be, or at least that's, it's my preference. I always find that in the second or third sort of row of everything, literature, filmmaking, whatever, you find these people that are sort of, they're professionalized, they're making a living out of what they're doing. They're not so well known, although they're known, and their work is amazing. And it's there. It's not at the top. It's actually 2 levels down, where you find all of these people that are, fully professionalized. They're writers, at least that, they're perhaps more minority, but they have, sort of commitment to the work, that is fantastic. So that's what you have, like, critics awards, and you have, things, and film festivals and things that are not, exactly the Oscars, but something that points The people at the top and the people that sort of at the bottom take care of themselves. The issue is, how we make sure that the people that are doing incredible work can continue to do it and thrive, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if we're talking about when we're talking about movies, okay, we're talking about movies, then that's I mean, it's not necessarily easy, but it's simple to some degree, but now we're not talking about movies. We're talking about work inside of psychedelic culture, which, okay, in my case, that's easy, because if we're talking about something that like I'm doing or like you're doing, that's easy because what we're both doing is legal. I'm producing media content. I'm producing, conversations, written works, blah, blah, blah. You're giving lectures, you're doing research, you're working with ICERs, you're facilitating, workshops for people. That's great. That's legal. But then how do we as a culture help to support people who are doing good work when the work that they're doing is actually illegal? I can see an example of this. Recently I had Chad Charles on the show, and there was a discussion about this group called the Conclave, which is a group of anonymous 5-MeO DMT facilitators looking to build a code of ethics and best practices. And with Chad, he talked about going around when he's touring around, doing things and getting communities of practitioners together to really talk with each other and sort of learn from each other and all the rest. But that with the Conclave, they choose to remain anonymous, and they choose to remain anonymous because even though 5-MeO DMT is not illegal explicitly in Canada or illegal in other countries, it is in some countries. And simply because it's not illegal doesn't mean that you won't get into some serious trouble for providing it. There's just all these legal issues that present real, genuine risk to not only the people, but the communities around which these people are sort of facilitating and providing. So what are your thoughts in that context? Like, what does it look like to sort of like help that few tiers down people be celebrated, while also what they're doing is something that is not legal?
I think it's exactly what you said about the Conclave. You celebrate the work. What benefits the community as a whole is not necessarily that you put a spotlight on an individual, which might cause a different sort of sustainability crisis as everybody tries to approach the person. But that you make sure that their work is being visualized, which is exactly what they're doing. Is like, how do you make sure that the best practices are seen, and I'm, because I come from this, but I have just a sort of personal bias towards stories. I tend to collect stories. For me, it's an issue of stories. And I'm very, very interested in these sort of stories that bring like the story I said about the documentaries, or stories that sort of have embedded, a lesson in them. And I find that when you go to people that have been working with ayahuasca for a long time, these stories are always there. For example, the União da Vegetal, the UDV, it's the largest church in Brazil. It's more than 20,000 people, though they're very discreet, and up to now they're not so well known, even though they're actually very large. And they've been at this now for 60 or 80 years, and don't quote me on this, but decades. And and they're structured like a church. It's sort of a hierarchical body of, and they're not mestres, and they're not priests. They're called mestres, and they move up sort of a ladder until the sort of top circle of people. And I was talking with one of these mestres, and I asked them, I said, I understand that the UDV, is a complex, structure. 20,000 people. You need secretaries, you need accountants, you need, all of these. And those people are receiving a salary. But at which point do the mestres, because I knew that the mestres, they have day jobs and they just do this on the weekends, at which point on the ladder as they go up, do they sort of, in Spain you call it liberated, so you stop doing your day job and you're just full-time on the salary of the church? This is the question that I asked them. So at which point as they go up, do they stop their day jobs and they just get a salary for doing their spiritual work? And he told me, never. This is forbidden. you are required to have a day job always. And if you don't have a day job, or if your day job requires too much of you and you cannot attend your spiritual duties, then you just say so, and we have more people in the church and they will help you, or somebody else will take over. But it is the ability to maintain the day job and separate your economy, your life from this work that they consider spiritual, that is the key to keep the work, quote unquote, clean. Not only that, in the case of the digital, you're not only supposed to have a day job, you're supposed to be in a permanent relationship that works. In the case, you're supposed to be married and in a good marriage, because they say, what are you doing leaving other people if you can't even have a proper relationship with a single human being? These things, yeah. These things for me are really, really interesting, and I think there's a lot of wisdom in these things, this sort of accumulated wisdom that comes from, trying many things and failing at many things and having 80 years of trial and error to sort of evolve, this system. I think that's the type of spotlight that I have in mind. It's how do we begin to gather out of the community the best stories, the stories that have most wisdom in them. And we begin to circulate these things so that people have these references, and because, this story says a lot about the nature of money, the nature of your relationship. And it's one approach. There's also, there's other stories for approaches completely different. I know also people, from more shamanic perspective that say that you cannot, this requires such long training, so many trips to South America and such commitment that you cannot keep a day job. And that's also perfectly understandable and reasonable. But it's as you begin to collect these things, I think there's a lot of, I'll give you just one more example. In the Santo Daime in Brazil, which is again, 80 years old, a long time, they've been dealing with the issue of how you should talk to your neighbors about ayahuasca for a long, long time. So being which is really how we talk to the rest of society. Being that they are a church, and they're actually a Christian church, they do something that I've seen in very few or no other Christian churches, and it's proselytism is forbidden. So the doors of the temple are always open. Anybody who wants to come and drink ayahuasca with Santo Daime, they can just show up, ask for it, and after a few, they're welcome in. You can't tell your neighbors, I go to this temple and I've been drinking ayahuasca for many years and it's been really good for me. But you are forbidden by the structure to tell your neighbors, and I think you should try it, or I think it would be good for you as well. Now, and this has to do with advertising, not just proselytism. This is the nature of advertising, right? This is telling other people you would like this. The reason why they do it, when they say there was political reasons, when this rule was created, they were in a very sort of precarious situation with the rest of the community, etc. But I think there's a deeper wisdom there, which is that this, the potential effects that these substances can have on your life are so life-changing. They're so it's so big what could happen to you once you go here. That under no conditions are you to suggest to other people that they should try this, because who are you to suggest to people something that could totally revolutionize their lives, even with the best intentions, right? Which brings me to, and you see how these stories tie, right? This brings me to, now people are talking about prescription psychedelics, and I have to wonder, and I wonder very often, can you really prescribe this to people? I mean, can you give this? Can you just tell a total stranger, hey, you have long-term depression, I think you should try this? Because, it seems to me that part of what we learn from tradition is that people have to want it. And the main reason why they have to want it is because if you don't want it and the experience gets difficult, you're going to say, I want this to stop, and you're going to blame the person who gave it to you. You're going to fight it, like, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So, I can see a situation where a doctor says, I think, for you with your long-term depression, psychedelic would be, maybe psilocybin would be right for you, and then this person takes psilocybin, and halfway through the experience gets, uncomfortable, as it sometimes does. And then the person says, what the hell did you give to me? You poisoned me, make it stop. Mm-hmm. And it turns into hell. Right, so there's there's an issue with sort of voluntarily stepping into this space that I think is critical to this. It's critical even to this working, because if I saw one guy said that the main counter indication of ayahuasca is not wanting to drink ayahuasca, right? I always say, psychedelics are like a kiss. If you want it, it's fantastic, and if you don't want it, it's disgusting. It's really intrusive and sort of sloppy and right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, there's an issue there, around consent, around talking to others, and all of these things have already been at play with people who have been dealing with this much longer than us. And it's in them that we can find inspiration, at the very least, inspiration in terms of how to. And this is, when I imagine, how this should be, whatever. And I think it's these types of things. It's how we make these sort of stories emerge, so that they become sort of, if not common wisdom, they become something that is, it's known.
Mm-hmm.
It's known, and then everybody finds their own sort of position within all of these possible ways where we can, one can work with this or position oneself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that I'm seeing how much that makes, to me, that makes much more sense than putting somebody in particular, celebrating one person in particular.
Giving them an Oscar.
Yeah, because one of the, regardless, it was like power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Like even people with the greatest and most beautiful intentions, if a lot of power is projected onto them by people because they are earning some sort of like particular status inside of a culture, then the chances of that person being corrupted by that power increase with the amount of power that's being projected onto them, the amount of people that surrender their power onto that person. And so then we end up with situations where what, initially was good, oh yeah, this person's doing really good work, let's really celebrate what they do, until it becomes they're like the leader of this like massive so-and-so, and they're insulated, and there's supremacy structures around their position, and they do some things that they shouldn't have done, and then everyone tries to hide it, blah, 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 like the story, and so on and so forth.
It's really hard to handle. Yeah. There's a recent case in Colombia, terrible, with this guy that was actually, he won an alternative Nobel Prize. So much of these guys' beginnings were so promising. And so amazing what he was doing, and then 20 years later he had something that looked like a weird cult of personality, people getting on their knees before him, and of course the terrible sexual misbehavior and abuse and this. I have a good story about this. Once I drank ayahuasca with this one curandero that I really like. And it was a wonderful night, and he sang so beautifully, and the songs were so amazing, and I was just crying, and I was so happy. And and when the lights got turned on, the first thing I went was to give him a hug and to thank him, and he told me, disfrútalo, which in Spanish means you enjoy it.
Oh wow!
Right?
Yeah.
And so what he was saying was, this is not right. Your fantastic night is not for you to give back to me. So I think, oh, I'm such a hot shot, blah, 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 blah. This is you stay with it. You're really enjoying yourself. Enjoy yourself. But so he was giving that back to me. I think also that's an example of how people developed, best practices around even the most difficult parts. Even, adoration, which you would think is a good thing, becomes a poison. The minute you have too much of it, Then later I realized actually that there was another guy next to him who had also been singing and who sang much worse. I didn't like his song so much. I had no inclinations to give him a hug, and I didn't. But when I left, I saw him sort of, and this is also a problem, right? So it's how do you, navigate these complicated and difficult waters, to make sure that everybody's and things are in their place.
It's interesting. It brings me back to how we raise kids. Praise or blame, good or bad, which colleague, friend, someone I look up to here in my community, who's been doing work around this concept for many years, talks about the coercive cycle and the collaborative cycle. And the coercive cycle is good, bad, right, wrong, praise, blame, and all of which is basically using guilt and shame, or the alternatives to guilt and shame, which is, like praise and celebration, to manipulate people's behaviors to be in alignment with a particular sort of moral, a moral code or a code of conduct. And that beyond that is to think outside of praise and blame, and to think that even the act of coercive praise and blame exists inside of a larger circle of collaboration, which basically sees everything as things happening inside of larger complex systems that require complex engagement to better understand. And that I think the central premise, what's the central sort of like the overarching phrase is like, you can't fall out of the universe, or something like that. And I'm not representing it very well, but it points very much to how, we raise children to be in this coercive cycle of like moving towards praise and moving away from blame and shame and guilt. And then that manifests in adult behaviors as well. And it manifests ongoingly in cultures too. So then we have this story about this shaman who said, like, you enjoy it. But then depending on sort of the underlying psychological modeling structures we have for understanding that might just end up making a person celebrate them even more in their head. Like, wow, they're just so humble. Wow, they're so high, something like this. So it goes really deep into some sort of fundamental issues of engagement we have as a society, which really, is sort of established in our early childhood, and then continues as we continue to participate in culture.
Yeah, when I hear what you said, I thought that the sort of the next level of what you said, which is something that I've also been thinking a lot about, is that, I am, in my work with ICEERS, and many of us are all sort of trying to work towards a future that where these practices are, where these practices are integrated in our societies and they can be practiced in a legal and safe way. Mm-hmm. To make it simple. But that means regulation, and the nature of regulation is to flatten things, right? Is to turn the enjoy it into a rule, into a code, and then by its very nature, Claudio Naranjo said, any good that turns into a must becomes automatically a bad.
Wow, that's great.
So there's an issue. I've been thinking a lot about this, that most of the systems that we have, the administration, the government, the law, are really a substitution for trust. They're necessary in a place where there's no trust. Where there's no trust, then you need a sort of an intermediary body that acts to ensure that everybody keeps to their toes and does more or less their part, right? So they're built around lack of trust, because when there's trust, you don't need to sign anything, you don't need to, you just have an agreement that is built between two humans, as psychedelics tend towards scale, and then good practices become codes. And good ideas become laws, and this thing goes up, right? There is this idea of scale, for example, around which in pharma industry, it's a fact of life. It's what they go for. It's one, for example, that in the case of psychedelics terrifies me. Because I have a hard time imagining how you can scale psychedelics unless you're cutting corners like crazy, and reducing this is like a long process. It takes a long time to learn. There's a personal growth that is also involved in being the type of person that can help and be with other people as you administer, and create these experiences. There's everything about it, even at the simplest level. I heard Rick Doblin say, and I hope I'm not misquoting him, that they figured out, post-traumatic stress disorder, which is what they're going to use MDMA on, is not very widespread sort of ailment, compared to depression, for example. Mm-hmm. However, they already know that even if they turn all the machines at full speed and all the trainees became trainers themselves and they use online systems and stuff, they are not going to be able to train enough people to deal with the demand just for PTSD, and MDMA that will come 3 or 4 years into the future when the FDA regulates it. This is already out of scale, something, and this is a substance that's easy to work with. This is a training that is not super exhaustive, but certainly compared with shamanic training, these people are already psychologists, etc., etc. But this sort of thing, as when things scale, it becomes very easy to do some things, like get everybody to install a taxi app, and it becomes really, really, really difficult to do certain other things, almost impossible. So, and then this lack of trust what it creates is sort of rigid rules around it, which I think are the other side of this praise blame. It's sort of the next level up,
And it makes sense to have, like, in the context of psychedelics, MDMA not being a psychedelic, but the understandably categorized in the discussion is the same, that there would be rules about who can and cannot give MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder in a clinical setting. That makes sense. And so I get that. And also, opening one door closes a door to another, because maybe there's somebody else that's doing something a little bit more mystical with the MDMA that actually works better for certain things and certain people. And now they're already criminals, but now they're even more criminals or something because they're providing medication without a license rather than just being drug dealers. But then in the case of, now this is something that goes back to what you were saying before about the dangers of proselytizing, to recommending somebody revolutionize their life, and the contraindication of not wanting to drink ayahuasca or whatever. And somebody goes into I'm thinking about like those classic pharma commercials where it's like, ask your doctor about psilocybin for you today. Side effects include. But I could see that being an issue, right? Because the way that the pharma industry, which is also heavily informing the healthcare industry, looks at substances for medicine is very much from a biological psychiatry kind of way. You take the substance, you take the physical substance, changes the physical problem, you get clinical outcome. That is not in any way the case with psilocybin. There's so many complex variables and nuances that need to be fine-tuned that are not as easy as prescribing. And it's not as easy as guaranteed that it's going to work, so there's like a lot of nuance and complexity that is required. And that's the type of nuance and complexity that is being established in the research at, say, Imperial and Johns Hopkins and, even underground for the last 30, 40 years, right? But it's being established as the basis of clinical practice. And I see this kind of as a positive thing, that there's two ways of looking at this. Either, the edges of the things are going to be shaved off. We're going to amputate certain stuff so that it fits to meet the demand, right? We just fast train people for psilocybin, and they don't get the kind of training that we need, or whatever it is, the amputation that you're talking about. And the other possibility is that the practice of medicine itself will change as a consequence of what is discovered in the research and the expectations for clinical facilitation with this particular substance. And then, of course, the story of successful results with this change becomes possibly something that gets institutionalized. So I kind of forget why I started talking about that, but I kind of see how it could go both ways. And in the case of psilocybin, I think there's a good chance that it is going to shift the way people practice medicine, because you have to think about medicine differently in order to provide psilocybin for depression in a way that's actually going to be effective.
That's I think the real value of these substances, that they make us question that they make us question the paradigm. Once in one of these conferences, I was working on the presentation, and I was behind the scenes, and there was a closed door meeting of psychedelic therapists. These are most psychologists doing psychedelic therapy, and I was just overhearing while I was working. I was sort of back on the wall, and two comments really surprised me. One of them, and these are the people that are sort of on our side. One of them was complaining about how boring it was. Because they're just giving this to somebody and they're putting a mask and some headphones, and now you have to sit next to this person for 4 hours, and okay, sometimes they need help, but many times they don't, and then you're looking at 4 hours by yourself, just and some of them try to meditate, some others say that it was spiritual practice, but many of them were bored or very bored because they were waiting for their training, which is talk afterwards.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I thought, wow, this is amazing. This would be a non-issue in a shamanic context. If you're bored, it's because you can't sing.
Right.
You're not working. And then the other thing was that there was a real debate. Is should really be people really be required to try this themselves before they give it to others? And this is an actual debate, and this will be a big debate as MDMA and psilocybin get bigger, which again, in the traditional world is a non-issue. In the traditional world, maybe only the doctor takes the psychedelics and the patients don't. This was very widespread. And this reminds me of a story, that I live in Spain. Spain for 60 years was a dictatorship by this guy called Francisco Franco. He was military and deeply Catholic. So it was very conservative, very right-wing, and very religious dictatorship with censorship and all of these things. And during this time, in the 50s and 60s, there was a very public psychiatrist. He was called Dr. López Ibor, and he was sort of the most mediatic guy. He was, when they interview a psychiatrist on TV, it would be him. And he was, of course, a man of the regime, deeply devout Catholic, very conservative psychiatrist. And these people in the University of Madrid, they were experimenting with LSD in the 50s, quite openly, like many other psychiatrists all over the world, when this thing opened up. And they asked him on an interview, and they say, what do you think about LSD? And he said, this very conservative, deeply devout Catholic man, he said, I think LSD will be the initiation ritual of the psychiatrists of the future. And I thought that was, amazing and amazingly interesting. A recent person once, was asking me, okay, but if you could have it your way, what would you do with all of this? And I said, I would be giving it to the doctors. I think people who are in the health professionals would greatly benefit from psychedelics. They have the sort of mental preparation to deal with their effects much better. They require less care, can handle their own mental states and relativize them to a degree, at least perhaps better than most of us, and they would be the perfect sort of, that's the type of effect we have. I was thinking, we're going for the patients, and perhaps we should be going for the doctors, because that's how you make the revolution, and because it would greatly benefit them in their work. Mm-hmm. Not because it's, it gives them better insights into their patients or whatever, but because they're tools of self-knowledge. And for people who are in the health professions, self-knowledge is key, because otherwise your own projections are going to bring you down, right? If you're a psychologist, a psychiatrist, if you're a social worker, if you're this sort of, nurse, these people, it's absolutely key that you're able to recognize your own mental states and, and work from a place of stability. So, now that we're thinking big and being, I think that guy's idea is really, really interesting. The idea that somehow, because that's actually how it works in the traditional context very often. Very often it's the shaman that does most of the drinking or all of the drinking. Mm-hmm. That's importantly and first of all a tool for the shaman. So this idea that in a future these substances could become first of all a sort of a pathway, a door, a part of the process that you go through, of course, if you want, always voluntarily, to become a doctor, to become a person that takes care of other people's suffering. I think it's really appealing to me.
Yeah, I can think of it as like I'm seeing it in my head around, although I'm a big proponent of psilocybin, so I'm gonna reach into psilocybin. Psilocybin doesn't have the same hyper suggestibility impact as things like LSD and apparently mescaline, but it kind of has like its own energy in some way, its own sort of direction, an inner intelligence that's present there. But I could definitely see how the context in which the set and setting, the sort of psychological context and the socio-cultural context changes the way the psilocybin experience manifests. And so if you're becoming a doctor, there's like the Hippocratic oath, and it's like actually quite an important thing. It's a very meaningful thing, an initiation to say, I am a doctor now. I am now committing my life to the care of others. That is mixed in with, that is the context in which somebody takes psilocybin and receives the care of others through their suffering. Like, I mean, I think the introduction of psychoactives, I think especially psilocybin, because I'm a big proponent of it, in different sort of like rituals of advancement inside society and inside a culture would be very positive. So I can only imagine how meaningful that would be insofar as how that doctor then shows up to their practice for the rest of their lives, the rest of their working lives.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most interesting things that psychedelic teach you is that you're actually engaged in a relationship with the medicines that you take. It's not exactly like, well, we don't take aspirin like that anyway, but psychedelic, you cannot take psychedelics like aspirin. You have to sort of develop a sort of, a process, a respect, a help at this, and you understand that it depends on your position, what this particular molecule is going to give you or not give you, and what work you do on yourself. So at the end, it demands of you a type of presence and a type of relationship, that we have completely. That's one of the things that we've amputated, from our medical practice. We have no relationship whatsoever to our substances. We just swallow and, what we're given. I think these, for doctors, for example, would be sort of, that's where the paradigm shifts. And that's among the sort of most interesting, greatest sort of gifts that these plants, these substances bring, And back to, worry and amputating is like, it's how do you make sure that this doesn't get amputated, that you go into places like, of course, no, doctors don't have to take this, and, don't worry about the boredom. We can have, well,
Yeah. So, cause I'm thinking about it, it's like, when I have been supported through really deep psychedelic experiences, it's always been with people who understood what I was going through. And the fact that they understood what I was going through made it easier for me to trust them and to allow myself to be co-regulated with their grounded energy. And I could only imagine how detrimental it would be for somebody providing psilocybin clinically not to understand from a deeply visceral and embodied place the impact of a warm smile and a hand to hold. I could tell you that, and you could be like, oh yeah, okay, for sure. I mean, like when I've been sad, I've had a hold now, but not when you're deep in encountering your suffering with psilocybin. It's, I mean, not to say that's the only place to feel that deep, profound impact, but that it is a place where its impact is undeniably strong. And to have a provider that doesn't understand even that simplest thing, I think does great detriment to the possible outcome, clinical outcomes for the person in the therapy.
Yeah, and it's the reason why psychotherapists have to be in psychotherapy themselves, and they have supervisor, right? I mean,
So let's. Okay, so I've got two sets of questions.
Quick thing.
Yeah,
because I have to leave in 10 minutes. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. So then I won't ask you about the next thing, because I was like kind of going that we still had about half hour more, and maybe that's something we could just jump on for like or I could send you the question and you can record it on your own and just send it to me, because I'm very curious of how this discussion extends to the consumption of psychedelics by people who will be leaders, political leaders. Now, if doctors should be taking it, well, what about people who are proposed to govern the body of an entire country? which is not something that we can unpack in 10 minutes. So I won't ask you to. So let's.
Yeah, and I can record that, no problem.
Okay, great, awesome, thank you. So then, in the last 10 minutes, if you think it's possible, I would love to hear what your work with ICEERS is doing insofar as the issues we're talking about here today, and how people can learn more about ICEERS and the work that you're doing there.
Yeah, I mean, a lot, you know, I will give you just a few examples of the things that I'm doing. You know, I'm social innovation coordinator in ICEERS. Social means people and innovation means new things. So, you know, my work is to think about getting people to do things that they haven't done before. That's basically it. And hopefully better things. So, you know, one part of the work that we're doing has to do with this sort of recopilation of stories, and you've only heard a few. These stories come from talking to many people that are working with this, you know, at all levels, both in South America, indigenous, in Europe, in the United States, and, you know, workshops that we run where we sort of, which is what's important is not just that I collect this sort of knowledge, ideas, best practices, stories, but that I share them back so they begin to circulate. Inside of this, there's sort of a deeper objective that has to do with how collectives organize themselves in order to gain legitimacy in our societies. And, you know, this is like, you know, what civil rights, women's vote, you know, gay marriage, you know, acupuncturists. You know, this has happened many times before. You know, new practices come, or old practices, but, you know, practices that are outside of sort of what the society accepts or the state accepts. They organize themselves and they make demands. And, you know, after many years, usually, you know, the government caves in, you know, at least in some of our societies. So it has to, you know, that has to do with that. I think the answer for the future of psychedelics should be close to the basis, should be close to the psychedelic community themselves. But because of, you know, clandestinity, it's a very atomized community. So it's important to create space where these stories flows and begin to create the emergence of a model or an idea, a proposal of what this could look like. In some places, this is going very fast and people are beginning to organize or take something that begins to look like what you described with 5MEO, you know, a sort of union or a guild, you know, which is the first step. And then I'm also trying to see where this is something that the community does. You know, ICEERS gives support. We're not leading this process. We're not organizing this process. We're not planting a flag for everybody. We're just seeing where it happens, and we're just giving support. Support that usually has to do with, you know, very mundane things, you know, actual support. And then we see where we can help. You know, so for example, you know, next in our work we're beginning to give shape to a system. Now sicker and sicker people are arriving to take, for example, ayahuasca. And they are coming with questions, they're coming with a list of medications this long. Okay, we're trying to create a structure and ICEERS so we can give somewhat answer these questions about whether this can be mixed or not, or whether it's a good idea or not for this person to drink ayahuasca. This would be, you know, anonymous service. This is the type of thing that ICEERS can do. We can get the doctors, the pharmacologists, we can organize them, we can set up an email, and we can answer requests. This is going all the way to bigger emergencies, all the way to psychotic. We're having a pilot. We're beginning to build a pilot in Spain for a support center that will reach all the way to the most extreme cases, for example, psychotic breakdowns, where because most people, you know, this happens very rare, but when it happens, people are very afraid to take this person to the hospital because they're afraid they will be arrested themselves. They're very afraid, and at the same time, they have in their hands one person for whom they're responsible, and they don't know how to handle it. Well, you know, we can help with this. You know, we're setting up a sort of structure where there's a number of psychiatrists that are on call and that can handle these, do the intake, do an evaluation, prescribe an antipsychotic if necessary, and even, you know, create a safe space where the person can be for 3 or 4 days. Where that would include, you know, psychiatric care and, you know, whatever shamanic or you know, spiritual practices are there to make sure that these people are as well taken care of as possible. And again, this is a pilot, but this has to do. But the idea is that you build the knowledge, you figure out how it could be done, and then you spread it. This has to do with with a thing that worries me a lot about unintended consequences of the decriminalized thing, which is that all it takes is for 5 or 6 really bad accidents in a row. Some kids that take too many and fall off a thing or get on a car and get in an accident, for a public panic to occur, and sort of for everything to move backwards. So it's very important that as we open, decriminalize and open these spaces for these wonderful plans for people not to be punished, to work with this, the community itself begins to build support structures that handle all the bad cases, the accidents, and the bad reactions. Because if we don't do that, then the government will feel called to do it itself, and basically. And the most normal way to do it is to pull backwards and say, no, this is too problematic. We've had 7 accidents in a row. So as you see, I'm trying to, I move between thinking about, what future we would like to be, and about what, very concrete steps need to happen now to make sure that this path continues, hopefully smoothly, and that we don't suddenly go backwards.
Well, Jerónimo, I'm respecting your time here. I'll get from you later the links for people to learn more about ITSeers and what you do. So that'll be in the outro. And just thank you very much for your time today. And I look forward to catching up again sometime in the future.
Well, man, it's a real pleasure. Talk to you soon.
And cut. Okay, thank you very much for tuning into this episode. If you'd like to know more about Jerónimo's work, please follow the links in the show notes to this episode, in particular to check out the work of ITSeers. For the show notes, I've also, which are at jameswjesso.com for episode 122, I have also included some links to some of my favorite lectures that he's given over the years. There was the piece there about having him do a recording about whether or not politicians should have to take psychedelics before they could be in office. That recording never ended up happening because it was not too long after we recorded this. Then all of a sudden the pandemic was a thing and priorities get reshifted when the world goes under some expression of lockdown due to a highly disruptive contagion. So that didn't happen. But it might still. It'll go up on the ATTMind Clips channel when it does, where many pieces of this episode will also be. So thanks for tuning in. Thanks for going to ATTMind Clips YouTube channel to check out some of the smaller clips of this episode, to share with your friends. Really appreciate that. Subscribing, really appreciate that too. And becoming a patron or leaving some sort of PayPal donation. Also appreciate that. Links are all included in the show notes to this episode. The most primary one being jameswjesso.com/support. Yeah. Before we close out, thank you to the sponsor of this episode, the Formula Nootropics Company, where they have a collection of different stacks, and they have a program where you sign up, and then you get each of these different stacks and you try them out in different ways and find out which one works for you. And throughout the course of your membership, you narrow in on the one that works best for you. The one that generally works best for me is Creativity Stack. So check that out if you're interested. You can get a discount by using the coupon code Jesso for 20% off your first order. And you could do that by heading to jameswjesso.com/formula. Okay, thanks for tuning in all the way to the end of this episode. I will see you on the next one. And in between now and then, take care.